The Menendez brothers' case is making headlines again as new evidence is brought to light. Lyle and Erik Menendez, convicted of murdering their parents in 1989, are fighting for resentencing, claiming years of abuse by their father. Two critical pieces of evidence form the backbone of their appeal. The testimony of Roy Rossello, a former member of Menudo, who alleges that Jose Menendez molested him, and a letter Erik Menendez wrote to his cousin, detailing similar abuse. But some, like Kathleen Cady, an attorney representing the Menendez family, believe this letter could be a fabrication, casting doubt on its authenticity. Defense attorney Mark Garagos argues that the original prosecution failed to adequately consider the brothers' claims of sexual abuse, a topic society wasn't fully ready to grapple with in the 1990s. He believes this bias played a major role in their life sentence without parole. In a dramatic twist, Roy Rossello's allegations add new weight to the brothers' defense. The question now is whether the killings were motivated by self-defense after years of abuse, or, as the prosecution maintains, driven by greed, citing the brothers' extravagant spending after their parents' deaths. A habeas corpus petition has been filed, arguing that the brothers' convictions should be reduced to manslaughter based on this newly surfaced evidence of abuse. Los Angeles District Attorney George Gascón is now reviewing the evidence and the brothers' conduct in prison. He has hinted that a more modern understanding of sexual violence might support their case. But Gascon's potential recommendation for resentencing is not without controversy, particularly given its timing just before his re-election campaign. Family members of the Menendez brothers have spoken in favor of their release, highlighting years of trauma and remorse. They argue that the brothers have rehabilitated themselves in prison, becoming mentors and leaders in various programs. However, critics suggest that Gascon's support for resentencing may be more politically motivated than a reflection of true justice. In the end, a judge will have the final say on whether the Menendez brothers will receive a reduced sentence or continue serving life in prison. The legal battle over their fate continues, with significant implications not only for their future, but for the broader handling of historic abuse claims in the justice system. It's all from my side. Over to studio for discussing a deep down on this matter.
Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when you sent in this request for the Menendez brothers, I was like, really?
Yeah.
This case, it's like iconic. Everyone knows the basics.
Right. Two brothers, Beverly Hills, murders.
Exactly. But then I got into these articles you sent over, one from Fox News and the other from People magazine.
Oh, interesting combo.
And let me tell you, there's so much more to this whole thing than just the headlines. It's wild.
Yeah, this case has been going on, 3 decades now?
Over 30 years.
And even with these new developments, it really makes you think about how we, as a society, understand abuse and justice.
And how the legal system handles new evidence after, a verdict has already been reached.
It's a big question.
Huge. Okay, so anyone listening who needs a refresher, let's rewind to 1989. Lyle and Erik Menendez, 21 and 18 at the time.
Young.
So young. They're convicted of killing their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez.
In their mansion.
In their Beverly Hills mansion. Like, it's a scene straight out of a movie. But here's the thing. The brothers claimed self-defense.
They allege years of abuse from their father, right?
Exactly. Sexual abuse specifically.
And that's where things get really interesting. I mean, think about it. Back in the early 90s, public awareness of sexual abuse,
especially against boys,
was so different. It wasn't something people talked about openly.
It was taboo.
Totally. So you can imagine how their defense, centered on this abuse, might not have had the same impact on the jury back then as it could today.
It's a totally different world now. The cultural context really matters, doesn't it?
It shapes everything.
Okay, but the prosecution, they really pushed hard on the greed motive. They kept pointing to the way the brothers spend money after inheriting their parents' fortune.
Oh, right. The spending spree.
Rolex watches, Porsche, even a restaurant. It's like...
not a good look.
No, not at all. So now, fast forward to today, and we have this potential bombshell new evidence. Roy Rossello, he was in Menudo, that pop group.
Oh, yeah, I remember them.
So he's come forward saying that he was abused by Jose Menendez, too, back in the 80s. And then there's this letter written by Erik Menendez to his cousin before the murders, detailing the alleged abuse.
His cousin Andy.
Yes. Andy Ketano. Sadly, he's passed away, but the letter surfaced recently.
Adding another layer to this whole thing.
It's insane. So we have potential corroborating evidence from someone completely outside the family and a letter written before the murders.
Supporting their claims.
It's huge. No wonder the Los Angeles District Attorney, George Gascón, is reviewing the case.
It's definitely significant, especially given how much our understanding of abuse has changed since the original trial.
Yeah.
But we have to be cautious. Not everyone's convinced.
Right. Because their uncle, Milton Anderson, Kitty Menendez's brother, he's totally against any leniency for them.
He still believes it was all about the money.
Right. Yeah, he's adamant that the murders were driven by greed and that the abuse allegations are completely made up.
And to add to that, Anderson's lawyer is raising some serious questions about the letter Erik wrote.
Oh, wow. This is getting complicated.
She's claiming there's evidence to suggest it might be a forgery.
A forgery.
And says she's going to give that evidence to Gascon's office. So now we have this letter. It could back up the brother's story.
But it might be fake.
It throws a wrench into things for sure.
Yeah.
Like, how much weight should be given to this letter? Is it enough to actually overturn the verdict? And how do you even prove a letter from decades ago is fake? It's a lot for the legal experts to sort out.
And ultimately, it's up to a judge to decide, right?
Right.
We also can't ignore the politics swirling around all of this. Gascón is up for re-election, and his opponent is using this case saying Gascón is soft on crime.
It's become a political football.
Totally. Suddenly, it's not just about the legal stuff, it's about politics, too.
It's a reminder that these high-profile cases, they often get caught up in political agendas. Just makes a complicated situation even more complicated.
So to recap, we have new evidence supporting the brothers' claims of abuse, but there are questions about its authenticity. We have family members who are strongly against any kind of resentencing, and we have a district attorney facing political pressure because he's reviewing the case.
A lot of moving parts.
Definitely. So what's life been like for the brothers in prison? I mean, they were young when this all happened.
Right. And they've been behind bars for over 3 decades.
What have they been doing all that time?
Well, according to their lawyer, they've both been model prisoners.
Really?
Apparently, they've been involved in creating programs, counseling other inmates, mentoring. They've even gotten college degrees.
So they're trying to make something positive out of their situation.
It seems that way.
But how much does that even matter when it comes to resentencing? Does good behavior somehow negate the crime?
That's a tough one. It definitely adds another layer for the judge to consider.
And then there's this argument from their attorney, the brother's attorney, that if they were the Menendez sisters, the whole thing might have played out differently.
Interesting.
He's basically suggesting there was gender bias, that the jury didn't take their claims of abuse seriously because they were men.
That's a thought-provoking argument, and one that, given our increased awareness of male sexual abuse today, deserves some serious consideration.
For sure. Back then, society viewed male victims very differently.
Yeah, it makes you think about how much those societal biases, even the unconscious ones, could have influenced the jury's perception of their case.
Okay, so we have this incredibly complex legal situation mixed with political pressure from the DA's reelection. And then we have to think about the brothers' claims of abuse, their behavior in prison, and the possibility of societal bias influencing the original trial.
Definitely a lot to unpack. This case highlights how hard it can be to find justice in a system where new information can come out years, even decades later.
Especially when societal perspectives are always shifting.
Right. It makes you question how we define justice when everything around us is constantly changing.
And we can't forget the victims in all of this. Jose and Kitty Menendez. Their family members, especially Milton Anderson, they've been vocal about their pain. They believe justice has already been served and that the brothers should stay in prison.
Their pain and their perspective, it's a vital part of this story. Absolutely. We can't lose sight of that.
So where do we go from here? Gascón will be announcing his decision on whether to recommend resentencing any day now. What are you most curious about as this case moves forward?
For me, it's about how much weight the judge will give to the new evidence, especially that letter from Erik.
And whether the brothers' claims of abuse will be seen differently now with our current understanding of these issues.
It's going to be fascinating to watch it all unfold.
Well, sure. Well, we've covered a lot, but there's still so much to explore.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just how much public attention this case has got.
Oh, totally. From the very beginning, it's been everywhere.
I mean, remember, it was one of the first big trials to be televised.
Yeah.
Everyone was watching it, all the drama unfolding.
And it sparked so many conversations, right? Like nationwide debates.
About wealth, privilege, families, what justice even means.
It felt like everybody had an opinion about the Menendez brothers.
And those opinions, they weren't just, background noise. They could actually influence what happens in court.
Especially in a case this big. I mean, judges aren't immune to that, are they?
No, they're human. They see what the public thinks.
Especially now with social media, it's like a megaphone amplifying everything.
So much pressure on everyone involved in cases like this.
So how do you think all that public attention, all those opinions, might affect the judge's decision if there is a resentencing?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, on the one hand, you've got this growing sympathy for the brothers with the abuse allegations coming out.
And people understanding trauma better now.
Exactly. People are looking back at the case with a fresh perspective, thinking about the time period, how views have changed.
Like we're reevaluating the whole story, seeing that things aren't always so black and white.
Right. And a lot of people think the brothers deserve another chance, that they've done their time, shown remorse.
But then you have the victims' families who are completely convinced the original verdict was right.
And they've been very vocal about their pain, their loss, their belief that the brothers should stay in prison.
It's a lot for the judge to balance. The legal arguments, the evidence, what society thinks, all under this huge spotlight.
It's a big decision, that's for sure. One that could have an impact far beyond the courtroom.
Speaking of impact, what about the whole question of motive? The prosecution in the original trial, they really pushed the greed angle.
Yeah, all that spending after the murders.
Right. But the defense, they argued it was a way of coping with the trauma, the years of alleged abuse.
Self-preservation, not cold, calculated greed.
It's hard to reconcile those two sides, isn't it? You see these seemingly privileged young men throwing money around, but then there's this whole other story of a deeply troubled family.
It shows that human behavior is rarely simple, doesn't it? So many layers, hidden reasons, things we don't see.
And it makes you wonder how much we should focus on what we see on the surface versus, digging deeper into someone's psychology, their emotions.
It's not about picking a side, choosing the story that's easiest to believe. It's about recognizing that the truth can be complicated, especially in a case like this.
And as we've said before, the passage of time, the fact that we understand things like trauma and abuse differently now, it can completely change how we see things.
What might have looked like an open and shut case of greed years ago can look totally different today.
We have to keep reevaluating what we think, recognizing that our own views are always changing.
It's a good thing. We're becoming more sensitive to the complexities of human behavior, how trauma affects people, how important it is to find justice that takes all of that into account.
All this legal stuff, the societal stuff, it's important, but let's not forget about the people at the heart of this.
The human element.
Exactly. The brothers themselves, whatever you believe about their guilt or innocence, they've spent their entire adult lives in prison.
That's a long time.
Their sister Lynn, she's been a constant advocate for them, talking about the abuse they suffered, pushing for their release. And their supporters point to how they've behaved in prison, how they've grown.
But you also have the family of the victims, who are still dealing with their loss, still believe the brothers should be in prison.
It's a wound that hasn't healed.
This case really shows the limitations of the justice system, how hard it is to find a solution that works for everyone.
Might not be a perfect ending, one that brings closure for everybody.
So, as we wait for Gascón's decision, there's a lot of anticipation, a lot of unknowns.
But that's what I find so interesting about this deep dive. It's not just about finding a clear answer.
It's about the process, right? Digging into a complicated issue, looking at the evidence, asking tough questions.
It's about learning more about human nature, how the justice system works, how our own views shape how we see the world.
And that's where you come in, dear listener. What are your thoughts on all of this? Have your views changed as we've been talking about this? Do you think the brothers deserve another shot? Or do you believe justice has already been served? We want to hear from you.
This case, in the end, it reflects our own values, how we see justice, what we believe about people. It makes us have important conversations, consider different points of view, realize that sometimes there are no easy answers.
And as we continue to grapple with these issues, cases like this one, they remind us how hard it can be to find the truth, how powerful perspective is, and that the search for justice never ends.
It's kind of crazy to think after all this time, all the attention this case has gotten,
Right.
people are still fascinated by the Menendez brothers.
It's true. It's become like this cultural touchstone. Everyone's heard of it.
People debate it, revisit it.
Documentaries, books, TV shows. It never really goes away.
It's a story that keeps coming back.
It really is. Why do you think that is? What is it about this case that keeps grabbing our attention?
I don't know. For some people, maybe it's the mystery of it all.
Yeah, like a glimpse into this dark, hidden world.
Exactly. But safely from our own living rooms.
Like a psychological thriller, but real.
But I also think maybe it's more than just that.
What do you mean?
I think true crime stories, they let us confront our own fears.
Our own darkness, in a way.
Yeah, and by looking at these extreme cases, it helps us understand ourselves, understand the world better.
Like holding up a mirror to society.
And then there's the whole justice thing.
We want to see things be made right.
Exactly. It reinforces our belief that there are consequences for actions.
And in a case like this, where it's not so clear who's the victim, who's the villain,
Right, it's not black and white.
it makes us question everything.
What's right, what's wrong? That's what keeps us talking about it even years later.
So we've talked about a possible resentencing, but what would that actually look like?
Like what would happen?
Well, if the DA recommends it, it means more legal battles.
Both sides arguing their case all over again.
Exactly. And the judge would have to consider so much. The abuse evidence, how the brothers have behaved in prison, what it would mean for the victims' families,
It's a huge decision.
with huge consequences.
Yeah.
And, the public would be watching every step of the way.
So much pressure.
Yeah. So as we wrap up our deep dive, we're left with a lot of questions.
This case, it's far from over.
And it's probably going to keep us all captivated for years to come.
It's a story that just keeps unfolding.
It's a story that makes us think about uncomfortable things, about ourselves, about society, about what justice really means.
For anyone listening, we hope this deep dive gave you a new perspective on this case. Maybe it raised some new questions for you.
It's a reminder that the truth is often complicated. Justice isn't always simple, and we're all constantly learning and changing.
Thanks for joining us as we explored the Menendez brothers' story. It's been a truly fascinating deep dive.